Today, I'm joined by Catgirl Kulak. He is the writer of a very interesting Substack called Anarchonomicon, and he is also a frequent guest on the Bailey podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Alex.
I'm really glad to have you on. I mean, you are kind of a recent addition to the space, a breakout star in many ways. You've been retweeted by a lot of prominent people like Jordan Peterson and Scott Adams. And yeah, you're definitely a sensation. I mean, yeah, tell me a little bit about what is it about, I mean, the so-called wider dissident rights space that made it so interesting to you and that made you want to be a participant?
Uh, Basically, it's the only space that ideas are actually happening. Um, so if you go to a university right now, you're just not encountering new ideas. Like none of the people you actually interact with are generating ideas. Uh, the university is right now is a space where you can spend 10 years and dedicate your entire career to becoming the person who writes articles circling around something that Hobbes or Spinoza or or some Victorian writer said, but it will never produce someone on the level of those writers. A philosophy course is where your aspirations to be a philosopher go to die. So it's very interesting that in the distant right space, you get people who are just going at it 100%, are producing ideas, are falling flat on their face producing ideas, but are actually trying, are actually pushing things forward, are developing aesthetics that really haven't been seen before. Um, the intersection of something is stuff as varied as traditional Catholicism or Nietzschean vitalism or or American Romanticism, all these different trends intersecting in odd ways. And Sturgeon's Law, most of it's crap, most of it doesn't go anywhere. But stuff can actually come out of that. Whereas left wing spaces, the university, these institutions are basically dead. It's all pretty much everyone, as far as I can remember, spent their entire career cowering, kind of hoping that if they just keep their head down long enough, they'll get tenure and then they won't have to say anything again. And they'll be safe for the rest of their career. And it's just, our institutions are hopeless spaces in a lot of ways. And of course, no one coming out of the university system or the media system or the publishing system at all measures up to figures that existed just 20 years ago. It's it's really dramatic how lively the online space is, how lively Twitter nons are versus how completely dead and cowering some of the most august and creative institutions are that were creative and august 20 years ago.
Yeah, you had a really interesting piece on your Substack about kind of the media side of this and the fact that it's pretty much indisputable that kind of legacy media institutions are on their their deathbed. And I mean, you kind of lay out an argument there about why this is happening. And I guess, the reverse of this is why a lot of these spaces, this kind of like, darker anonymous spaces are, or where the action happens, because it's become impossible for it to happen where, I don't know, not necessarily where it used to happen, because, part of your argument is also that it's always kind of been this way, but it's much more visible now because maybe you have a bit of contrast. But I mean, lay that out a little bit. I mean, why is legacy media dying?
So legacy media, it's really dramatic, especially in the case of Canada, because it's actually state funded. But in Canada, as recently as 2015, you had these legacy institutions in media that actually, on the face of it, were doing their job. Like I remember being a kid in 2014, 2015, and actually being impressed at how much news was breaking on Canadian talk shows. So there was this great figure, Steve Paikin, who did kind of the main NPR style talk show, hour long, discussion, basically what you'd think like a Bill Maher style talk show would be in the States, or kind of edging into what podcasts are now. But in 2008, 2015, he'd have figures like Jordan Peterson on, or Christopher Hitchens, Peter Hitchens. He had figure that had a huge influence on me as a kid. Niall Ferguson, the Harvard historian, not the epidemiologist. Um, all these interesting figures that are fairly influential on the American right and just in pop culture in general. And his interviews with them would get close to 6 million views sometimes in after airing YouTube videos, like serious viral stuff. Like if you were to point to one figure that's like, this person has made the transition from television to the internet flawlessly, it would be Steve Paikin and The Agenda. And right now you can go on theagenda.com, on the Agenda's website, or go to their YouTube channel, and they're getting hundreds, low thousands of views per video. Like like I actually did the math at one point, and I'm getting more views and hits on my Substack than they're getting on their entire show, which is being subsidized to the tune of millions of dollars a year by the Canadian government. And the question is, well, why is this? Why did they die? They had it. They had it in the palm of their hands. They were interviewing Jordan Peterson right in 2015 as all of this was taking off. And the answer is, well, they died out. They allowed their platform to die. They purposely killed it because they were being paid to, because the government was subsidizing them. So there's this. So on the face of it, you'd think, well, why would Justin Trudeau be spending millions of dollars on state-funded propaganda that no one's watching? You think even if you're a propagandist, you want people to at least see the propaganda. And basically, what I concluded is the BBC, the CBC, NPR, all the PBS, all these state-funded media sites, all these state-funded media platforms, channels, etc. They're purposely producing crap because they're being paid to produce it, and they're being paid to produce it so they won't produce the stories that are actually interesting. If you think of what actually drives viewership, what actually drives interest, what people are actually willing to sit down for 3 hours and engage with and spend good money to engage with in a lot of cases, it's Joe Rogan. People are very interested in intellectual discussion. They're very interested in heterodoxy. They're very interested in just having a weirdo like Jordan Peterson, who I don't think anyone has thought anything he's thought beforehand, and I don't think anyone's thought what he thought afterwards. I don't think it's actually possible to come away from Jordan Peterson discussion and know what he was trying to say in detail, or actually know what weird Jungian analysis he has is. But it's fascinating until you get bored of it, or have had enough of them. Like that's a person that if you're encountering him for the first time, it's very easy to spend just 10 hours trying to get the gist of what he's after. And basically, what we saw after Trump was all the mainline legacy institutions panicked and said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to engage with this. We're not going to replicate this process. So, and actually, you can see them having this discussion in 2016, 2017, 2018, where they're explicitly blaming their earlier coverage and chasing of ratings for why 2016 happened. There's this extraordinary episode in 2018 where the Monk Debates, this formerly august institution that's held in Toronto, is a debate series that's held every year pretty much. And this would get maybe 10 million views once you add in listens and everything. It would air on NPR, it would air on CBC, it would air on BBC. real international reach and event. And it was always meant to be an event. It was meant to be this great intellectual engagement. I think it actually got started in kind of the new atheism era when all our institutions were like, yeah, intellectual debate, go tear down these old Christian institutions. But it really built up this idea of debate in the public sphere, and this was one of the best examples of it. One of the best real platforms you had it going. And in 2018, they had a debate between David Frum, former George W. Bush speechwriter and now editor at The Atlantic, and Steve Bannon, Trump advisor and editor of Breitbart. And the debate was populism. Populism. And of course, David Frum argued that populism will not define the era, and Steve Bannon argued that it would. It was just a question of whether it was going to be Trumpian style populism or Bernie Sanders style populism. And during this debate, of course, there were protests. There were people trying to cancel it. The fire alarm was pulled, as far as I can remember. People were protesting outside. Ladies jumped up and shouted during the debate and had to be dragged out. You can see this entire mode of discussion around we need to deplatform these people. These ideas can't be allowed to be discussed. The rubes will latch onto them. To them, open debate is something that leads to Hitler. You know, if we want to defend liberal democracy, we can't allow liberalism or democracy. So what you see with legacy media is this massive pulling back, and the dramatic thing has been that even as their audiences have disappeared, so the Monk debate, no one really watched it after 2018. They censored their own results. They did in the Oxford style, where people vote at the start and then they vote at the end. And originally they reported that Steve Bannon had won massively, that he had actually managed to sway something like 30% of the audience from supporting Frum's position to supporting him, which, if you watch the debate, isn't actually that absurd, just because David Frum, like, the entire debate refused to engage with points. It was very canned ad hominems, you're a bad person, whereas Bannon, he really framed the question well, saying, well, it's going to be populism. It might not be my populism. It might be Bernie Sanders, but it's going to be some version of populism. So basically, if you hated the 2008 bailouts and you hated the Iraq war, you're going to support Bannon. And it was very clever how he did it. It was very rhetorically skilled, and they reported that he had won. 5 minutes later, they put out a tweet. No, that's not what happened. There was an error in the reporting mechanism. It was a tie. The votes didn't change. And of course, it's completely absurd. And the Monk debates have not been very interesting at all since. I think there was something recently with Stephen Fry and Jordan Peterson. They were debating something, but it was a shell of its former self. And basically, all the institutions we had that had some august quality, that obviously were tied into the system in some way. Noam Chomsky characterized it as manufacturing dissent. Obviously, they played a role in this crazy but no crazier. We'll only put these people on if they're visibly losing, and we won't air the interview, or we'll heavily edit it if, like, Jared Taylor looks like he wins in an interview. Like, my favorite example of kind of old media is, like, Jerry Springer would invite racists on his show, but he'd make sure it was edited in such a way that looked like they lost and the audience was turning on them. He'd never invite someone that might get the audience turning about to them, or he'd pick the audience so that it was incredibly kind of disproportionately representative of one demographic or another. So, like, if someone's being sexist, you'll notice that 80% of the audience are women, or if someone's saying something racist, also only 50% of the audience is black, as opposed to kind of a natural rate. But legacy media, at least before 2015, they're still trying to represent themselves as having the debate. They wanted to stack the deck, but they wanted it to be represented. Uh, 2022, the trucker convoy hits Canada. And of course, Steve Paikin, he's one of the most prominent interviewers in Canada, one of the most prominent topic shows. Not a single member representative of the truckers is ever brought on, not a single conservative MP. And we had major conservative MPs openly supporting the truckers. One of their most vocal supporters, Maxime Bernier, is the head of the People's Party of Canada. He supported them from the start. And Pierre Poilievre was the MP from the Conservative Party. The trucker convoy climaxed with his normal boss, Aaron O'Toole, being kicked out as leader of the party. And within 6 months, Pierre Poilievre was the leader of the Conservative Party. So you had two leaders of political parties. Well, one leader and one very prominent MP who would become leader, both endorsing it. Neither of them were invited on the agenda to discuss it. No representative from the convoy. The closest they got was they had a representative of the Canadian Civil Liberties Institute, who took great pains to distance herself from the convoy at all and said, well, obviously they're horrible. We need to denounce them, but we should be careful that maybe perhaps we don't infringe the right to protest, which obviously this was a matter of protest rights. The greatest crime they committed in terms of actual impositions on the city of Ottawa was illegal parking. It was a great example of probably one of the most peaceful protests in history for its scale and the amount of news coverage it got. And of course, no one was invited on the show to discuss that. No one watched the episodes. You can look these up online. They have maybe 10,000 views. But you think just 8 years before, Jordan Peterson had been making a stink about new trans speech laws in Ontario that you could lose your job or be jailed potentially for misgendering. And he was making a huge statement, and he was invited on the agenda then and got 8 million views. All suddenly, it's like, oh, Trudeau's money was very well spent. He could have had a huge national scandal that probably would have brought down his government, and instead he had it buried. There was no coverage. Everyone who's online followed it very closely, but my grandmother heard nothing about it, or if she heard, oh, there's people causing a ruckus. And anyone who is not on Twitter, not online, is engaging through cable news or legacy media, they all still largely seem to think that they're getting 2008 or 2015 news coverage, that they're actually even hearing what the stories are, which just isn't the case. And that seems to have been the real value of this from the perspective of CBC, BBC, TVO, NPR, PBS, all the state-funded broadcasters. And then you look, well, what about the private news providers? Completely different incentive structure. Shouldn't it change? And the answer is largely no. So in Canada, especially, there are no private broadcasters. Every newspaper, every TV channel is funded to some extent, if not or greater, by the government. Even prominent podcasts like Canada Land, if you're donated to that podcast, they receive massive amounts of state subsidies, and which should be obvious since they're carried on the CBC at points. But aside from like Rebel, which has its own problems, but is loyal to another government that isn't the Canadian government, and a few others that are really eccentric. There's a few like the Epoch Times is big here, and they're obviously captured by the Falun Gong and kind of that wing of Chinese political life, but But if you aren't talking about China, they're actually pretty good for covering most things. But so that's a state of media in most countries that aren't the U.S. Within the U.S., you look at who's funding CNN, who's funding Fox, who's funding MSNBC, and you watch an hour of MSNBC, you'll see ads for literal defense contractors. Like I almost fell out of my seat when I saw it. I was sitting there watching MSNBC. All of a sudden, an ad comes on for Raytheon. And of course, Raytheon offers no product whatsoever that any human being watching a show can buy. Like the only one who can buy anything from Raytheon, you either have to be a Saudi prince or you have to be a congressman looking to buy some Hellfire missiles. But they're advertising on MSNBC as if they have a product to sell, as if you could go to the store and get them as easily as you could get adult diapers or any of the other products they offer. And and obviously what they're doing is the ad for Raytheon, that's not the ad for Raytheon. The ad for Raytheon is what comes on after the ad for Raytheon, which is all the news coverage. MSNBC is the center for the American left. It's the most prominent, explicitly left wing news channel. And in a decade, MSNBC has not covered anything that was anti war. You can watch MSNBC for hours. You will not see like a Noam Chomsky type figure. You will not see Green Party representatives. You will not see representatives of the old left kind of who oppose the draft. You will not see documentaries about the old left opposing the draft by and large, because it's not being paid for by its organic advertisement. It's being paid for by the companies that are purchasing the ads and aren't really advertising. This is, I have a theory that this is why pharmaceutical companies are so powerful right now. Basically, they have a massive advantage over every other industry in America in terms of accumulating political power, because when they advertise on CNN or Fox or MSNBC, well, the natural audience for those are the incredibly old who still watch TV. So even if the return on an advertisement for this specific medical brand, or for what's the big Pfizer one, the dick medication,
Viagra.
Viagra. Even if an ad for Viagra, $1 of ad spend on Viagra only generates 30 cents worth of profit from sales. Well, that's a massive discount on your political advertisement if you're getting 30% of it back. So that I suspect that's why Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson, AstraZeneca a little, although they didn't exist quite before the pandemic, although they're a massive subsidiary of all the others. They're all incestuously interconnected. That's my theory of why they had so much political power at the moment of the pandemic, was because they could advertise and only lose 20 to 30 cents on the dollar, whereas if you're a defense contractor, it's a complete loss. Like, you aren't going to actually generate any organic sales from advertising Raytheon on CNN. You're just explicitly buying political power.
Yeah, that's a very strange thing, because I guess it's essentially lobbying for positive vibes from population in general, because I guess people have a certain idea about what Raytheon is, but I guess if you tell them about diversity and
Well,
inclusion at Raytheon, they probably maybe soften a bit on the
well,
concept.
my thinking isn't that actually has any effect. Like, the actual ad for Raytheon, you could replace it with blank air and it would do nothing except remove the fig leaf. The real thing Raytheon or Pfizer is buying is the fact that no media
It's the
company
news itself.
is going to run scandalous news about the companies that are advertising for it. So Steve Paikin isn't going to cover a story that's going to hurt Justin Trudeau. when Justin Trudeau is paying for his entire show. Uh, MSNBC is going to run a story against the military industrial complex when the military industrial complex is paying for their entire show. So it's kind of, if you want to model modern media, it's basically a blackmail ring that runs out of kind of their legacy prestige. No one's actually watching it. They aren't actually communicating much of anything, but they're getting paid massive amounts of money because they could go back and be respectable and like actually start covering stories at some point if they stop getting paid off. Like if funding wasn't cut entirely to Canadian public broadcasters and Steve Pagan had to compete in the open, he'd start doing immediately what Joe Rogan does and invite every figure from everywhere on to get as many eyeballs as possible. And that would be very threatening to the Canadian regime. So all this money is essentially a payoff to not cover the news, to not be an actual news personality. And of course, because these figures all existed in the era before modern internet communications, before social media, before this weird post 2016 dynamic, they all have incredible amounts of accumulated prestige that is incredibly potent in our culture and could be very damaging to the regime if suddenly say Anderson Cooper was viewing Steve Bannon or the QAnon shaman and giving him tons of good coverage, which like you could imagine if Anderson Cooper was let go and had nothing he could possibly do to get back in the graces of the regime. Well, what can he do with his brand recognition? That's what he'd do. Like that's what Joe Rogan's doing. That's what every online personality does. It's who's the most interesting voice in the room. Let's go talk to them. So all these prestige legacy figures could do that and probably would be doing that in any healthy media environment. But of course, they're being paid off because they still have huge amounts of prestige that were generated in the 2000s and before for shows that no longer exist. And of course, my grandmother, all the grandmothers in Canada, all the people over 70 who drive the vote and actually drive political policy, they won't believe anything unless a newscaster they've known since 2005 tells them something. So, like, my grandmother, if you try to talk to her about the trucker convoy or something, she'll say, "Well, I didn't hear that on the news." And, like, that attitude is incredibly prevalent amongst the elderly that, no, this is how you get information. And, of course, new legacy media has been telling them for about a decade that you can't trust what you read online. Of course, they're constantly being bombarded with scare stories about online scammers and stuff. They're after them that if they start believing something that contradicts the news online, they're about 5 steps from losing their social security number.
Yeah. But I mean, just by definition, this situation is not sustainable. I mean, don't know how old your grandmother is, but I mean, this is maybe a 10-year project.
I'd
And
say
it just,
closer to 5. Like
yeah.
this dynamic, it'll really be dramatic to look back in the history books at just wow, COVID happened right before that realistically, like the silent generation are declining massively. Like they're going to hit maybe 1/10 of their total numbers still alive within 5 years. The boomers, huge chunks of them are going in the next 5-10 years, and it'll basically, and legacy media just won't be there, and a massive portion of those that will be remaining will be senile, and it won't even have much of an effect on them. So there's kind of an interesting question. If you're a prominent legacy media figure, at what point do you quick make a dive for the exit before you can go down with the ship? At what point do you all suddenly say, no, I was secretly based the whole time, and write memoirs upon memoirs about how corrupt CNN and is to try and have some brand recognition and career after CNN goes down. But yeah, these institutions, because they run off of consensus. The value of CNN is you turn it on and you know exactly what all the news channels are saying. You know what the regime wants you to believe. You know what the consensus is. As soon as there isn't a consensus, as soon as that mechanism is so weak and anyone could be thinking or believing anything, a lot of the impetus to tune in at all is kind of gone, and most of the propaganda power of it is gone. If you can buy off 5 news stations and all the news stations are saying what you want, and that's 80% of the voice in the room, that's incredibly powerful. Even if anyone with any brain knows they should be weighing the 20% more, because you're controlling all the people who aren't paying attention. But if that shrinks down from 80% to 60% to 40% to 20%, all suddenly, while the news stations are saying this, that doesn't mean a whole lot. And really, really, when consensus institutions go, when big systems of collective belief go, they go all at once. Uh, the model would be like what's it, the emperor with no clothes effect, where enough people are in a room all suddenly see each other believing it at once, then no one believes it. You see this in with market prices. You see this with armies that are in the midst of battle. Then they see just enough people retreating that all suddenly everyone in the army is retreating. Retreating. There's a massive function of social consensus that drives politics, that drives markets, that drives militaries, that drives most social functionality. It drives everything down to who's the queen bee in your social circle. That at some point that's just going to flip, and I expect it will be quite dramatic the day it becomes obvious no one's listening to CNN, or all this state-run propaganda is just not believed, and even the think tankerati and the government bureaucrats are openly not buying the official story. Sorry, that we witnessed it happen in the Soviet Union, obviously, where there's a great moment with Ceausescu where he was giving his final speech, and his party loyalists, the group he had gathered in the room with him to give the speech, started booing that it had gotten to that point where even they didn't adore him. It could very quickly get close to that. There's enough partisanship that it wouldn't it certainly wouldn't be just everyone turning against the system and the world wakes up from history. It would be more the consensus falls apart, and now there's only kind of left-wing blue-haired gender goblins, and only online right-wing Twitter trolls, that all the legacy institutions just aren't there, and we're in the weird blend of anime and 19th century political ideologies that the internet has been building up for us.
Yeah, it's a strange thing, and it does seem like we're definitely headed that way. At least maybe from my perspective, because I'm in these spaces a lot, and it's it's strange to imagine just politically what that would look like, because we have had the illusion of a certain consensus for a long time, and even if you had inner party outer party dynamics, and it was essentially just one cabal of people running things at all times, there was that consensus that kind of kept a little bit of a lid on potential, I don't know, outbreaks of civil disobedience. But now things are pretty clearly fractured down, maybe not a middle, maybe even more than two sides, because there's lots of infighting in both sides. There's obviously a clear vision of the enemy, but still it's not necessarily that, like the right has any consensus. There's a lot of layers to it. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting in the next 5 years. Probably, everyone's looking to the U.S. because that's where all of this stuff has started early. It started more powerfully. I mean, Trump kind of set off all of these dynamics, but it's happening everywhere else in the world as well. I mean, you could also argue that even the Ukraine war is partly something that's been triggered by dynamics similar to these. So yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
the Ukraine war is a bizarre, bizarre microcosm because it kind of betrays just how absurd the partisan binary has become. At at one point, theoretically, it kind of made sense that there were socialists internationally and there were conservatives internationally. And in the domestic politic realm, obviously, you had Whigs, you had progressives, you had conservatives, and they all kind of lined up. So in the 1930s, you could look at who someone backs in abstractly and say the Spanish Civil War, and you basically knew which party they support domestically in the U.S. or Canada. Uh, there was this ideological division. You look at Ukraine, and basically nothing there is predictable from it. So, like, you look at the Russian side, and it's like, oh, these neo-Soviets who like will wave the red flag, and like even it's it's simplistic propaganda to say that's what Putin wants, but there are certainly factions within Russian society that at least have a nostalgia or nationalism for the old Soviet Union, and they're paired up with factions of Chechens who were at war with Russian society 20 years ago and now are a de facto mercenary group, but they're all backed by the descendants of the hard anti-communists in the US who see Ukraine as an extension of the liberal progressive empire. So these ex anti communists like Pat Buchanan will praise Putin and these fighters who are literally waving the Soviet red flag. And meanwhile, you have these genderqueer Antifa types waving the flags with the insignia on the inside of Azov battalion that's explicitly neo-Nazi, and you see very quickly just how ideologically fractured the world is and how artificial the kind of binary division is. That has to be a binary because American politics is a binary and the world is a colony of America. So everything eventually has to come down to which side of the American empire do you back. But as soon as that goes away, probably the world fractures into hundreds of pieces. I have this running theory that I keep trying to push, and no one quite buys it. But basically, the theory is that cycles of history are driven by who technology empowers. So you can look at the 19th century and say that's a great centralizing era. History was defined by who could conscript the most men and organize them and deploy them and have a massive organizational infrastructure to deliver messages between them. That the complexity of communication, the difficulty of that made vast centralized empires. The French state, ultimately everything just becomes a suburb of Paris. In France, ultimately Germany, that has not been united once in its history, gets united. Italy, which hasn't been united since the fall of Rome, ultimately it gets united. It's this massive centralizing era, and it's driven by the fact that body count is what matters, size is what matters. You can have this great technological leap by just throwing more people, more bodies at a problem, and all suddenly, actually, you can have a Pony Express that's delivering the messages fairly consistently, or you can have thousands of people all managing a telegraph line, and that's powerful. But you look at areas that are incredibly decentralized. In a lot of ways, on paper, they look a lot more technologically complex in terms of what the actual individuals are doing. So a musketeer in not a musketeer, a musketman in the 18th century actually looks pretty simple. He has a cloth outfit, he has a rifle, and he has some kit for cooking. Aside from the riflery, which is fairly the musket itself, most of them weren't even rifle, which is fairly simple. It's all pretty basic, pretty cheap. Whereas you look at, say, the early Renaissance or the medieval knights, these are incredibly capital and skill intensive endeavors. You basically have to train your entire life to be a medieval knight. You have to be skilled in a horse. You have to be skilled with weapons. You have to have something close to 100 times the average person's annual income in wealth on your person to make it all work. Like the closest analogy would be the cost of a modern fighter jet. And these eras were incredibly, incredibly decentralized. You can look at a map of the Holy Roman Empire, and there's hundreds, if not thousands, of individual polities. And the great distinction between these eras seems to be one is incredibly organization intensive, and one is incredibly capital and skill intensive. And if you look at the course of history just over the past 100 years, years from the very start just before World War One to today, warfare, communications, organization, everything has become incredibly capital and skill intensive. Social media is slightly an exception. It's become incredibly skill intensive, but the actual capital cost for the individual has come down. But to actually do it really well, like to be one of these people who can produce a video and have 6 million views on it and have it be polished as hell, that takes, that's a 4-year video course that a lot of those people get to have the animation and whatnot. Like just the simple stuff for like a map or something that Vox would put out. And you can see immediately in these legacy media institutions that were online. So like Vox, all their skilled people are now independent because they can make vastly more money producing content of that quality on their own than they can doing it for Vox. And this replicates across all levels. So my estimation is basically the state of the world right now, how centralized it is under one hegemon, is really an accident of history. That really the U.S. because it won history, it won World War One, and then it outlasted one World War One, one World War Two, and then it outlasted the Soviet Union. The fact that the world is centralized under the U.S. empire is really artificial. And if you look at the U.S. budget or what has to be done to maintain that hegemony in terms of raw expense, in terms of the amount of training you have to do, in terms of producing a new $10 million fighter pilot like every 10 years for each fighter jet, because of course, they retire, and then also you have to train someone up that's new and get them all the flight hours. It's remarkably unsustainable, the idea that we could have this level of centralization with this type of technology. If you have red coats and it's all driven by body count, big Napoleonic empires make sense. Whereas in the modern era, it's really remarkable that things haven't broken down to a Holy Roman Empire style indecipherable web of overlapping jurisdiction.
Yeah,
Of course,
there's still time.
yeah. If you read like Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash or a lot of cyberpunk fiction, this is actually what they were predicting in the 80s and 90s. This was kind of the Gibsonian thesis that as technology expands and complicates, that centralized government just becomes kind of impossible, and it becomes this world of hackers and weirdos pursuing things for their own ends and their own reasons. And largely that hasn't happened, and it's kind of mysterious that it hasn't. And Peter Thiel, his book is 0 to 1. He theorized that actually we've been incredibly technologically stagnant. That if you look at the advancement in the world of computers, which is and especially in the world of software, which is incredibly unregulated, theoretically kind of impossible to regulate. You can't really stop someone from typing up code on their laptop. Uh, Within that realm, we've advanced leaps and bounds. Like depending on your theory of AI, we're that close to breaking reality. It's been advancing so fast. Whereas if you look at, say, the world of atoms, like the world of motive, or the world of rocketry, or the world of home cooking or home design, like the accoutrements of the house, really very little has changed since the 50s. There's been kind of quality and sustainability improvements. Your car doesn't break down as fast, but then it's not as cheap a unit to buy. Very few 16-year-olds get new cars anymore. That within the world of atoms, progress has kind of been regulated out of existence. Uh, I I got in arguments with some friends of mine. My argument was, well, the flying car has been invented. It was invented in 1914. That was the year we started training teenagers to fly small planes that would fit in a large garage. And we trained these teenagers so well that by 17 they could fly around and shoot each other while doing it. And yet, of course, no one owns a personal flying machine in their garage, despite this being a technology that was available in 1916. And honestly, the average motorcycle shop could probably make one. So, so this was Thiel's argument that technologically we've been going backwards, kind of regulating it out of existence. And there's kind of an interesting question as to, well, what will win out in the end, kind of our regulatory cowardice or the inevitability of these technological advances. And kind of that's
You had
why.
a Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but you had a really good thread as well on one of the proposed alternatives to the USA as a global hegemon, and also a country that is known for less regulation on many of the areas that people complain about in the U.S. I mean, they're very kind of tech intensive. They put a lot of government money into development of new things, especially in biotech. It's all sorts of things that are very much beyond the pale in the U.S. are now being done actually in China. So, but your argument in this thread was that China itself is not as healthy and not in such a good state as people imagine, and maybe not the prime contender for a global hegemon.
So yeah, China is in a very deceptively weak position. Every kind of 4 years, people say, "Oh, it's going to overtake the U.S. in terms of GDP in the next 4 years," and it never happens. And a big part of the reason of that is China is fighting this incredibly uphill battle against its own demographics. So, the one-child policy, China has some of the starkest population decline. It's already started declining, depending on who you ask. But in terms of next 100 years, its population is looking at being cut in half, which doesn't sound too bad if you're unfamiliar with demographics. Well, that's still 700 million and more space. I want to pay less in rent, but because people now spend the last half of their life retired or unproductive, you need vast amounts of young people to support them, and that just doesn't exist. So what you're seeing in large sections of China is old people all suddenly you reach the peak of your career, and then instead of retiring, you just kind of descend until there are large parts of China where you find old people kind of picking through garbage to find bottles and stuff that they can sell for recycling. It's incredibly sad, but the big thing is that industries and a lot of the functions of civilization that depend on having young people, people in the 18, 20, 25, 30, people who are ambitious, who have something to gain, who are willing to put in sometimes extraordinary hours to try and get ahead or get somewhere in life. They're just running out of them. And there's a question of automation, but so far, nowhere's actually managed to keep an economy growing while the population has been declining. Japan is vastly richer than China, vastly more able to support its elderly population, and they've been stagnant for 3 decades. Their lost decade became the lost quarter century. Now it's looking like the lost half century it could become. So China obviously has been in a much worse position, and as early as 2008, 2012, Niall Ferguson had a great documentary to this effect, China, Triumph and Turmoil. It's all up on YouTube now if you want to look it up. But his thesis in 2012 was that China is actually running against the clock, that there's this huge question for Chinese civilization. Kind of, will it get old before it gets rich? Will it get rich enough to support its aging population before it's too old to get rich anymore? And it was looking like a photo finish, but there's been this mood coming out of China for a decade now. All their elite want to get their money out of the country. You can go to the east coast of the U.S. or the west coast of the U.S. or the west coast of Canada, and the prices of absolutely everything are insane because Chinese investors are trying to bring out as much money as they possibly can and get it anywhere but China, because fundamentally everyone in China is holding their breath in this regard. China's saving rate, which you think is a good thing, but it's also kind of said something about society. Their saving rate is the highest in the world, and the question is, well, what are they saving for? Because education isn't that insanely expensive in China. It's nothing like it is in the U.S. And they have only one child each for the most part. What are they going to do with all the savings? Like, what's the big expense they see coming? And largely it's retirement and social decline. Lots of Chinese save something like 50-70% of their after-tax income, which is unthinkable to us. But the Chinese, what they'll do with these savings, and this is they'll immediately invest it. So they don't trust the stock market by and large. They don't trust the bond market by and large, which if you had to deal with the Chinese stock market or bond market, you probably wouldn't trust it either. So what has been the thing forever for the Chinese to do is to pour it all into real estate. There are lots of cases of Chinese families that are much lower income than you or I am, and I'm remarkably low in income. They'll own 3-4 condos, and they're all mortgaged to the hilt, or they'll mortgage their first condo to buy a condo for their one child because they need that for marriage. But a big part of it is just that's what they do with their savings, is pour it into real estate, buy second and third condos in other cities they never even intend to visit, because that's perceived as a safe place to store their money. China has never had a housing market could collapse, or hasn't until now. And eventually declining population meets massively expanding housing market. Something has to give at some point. It looks like it might have already with the Evergrande collapse and the rolling fallout from that. It's very hard to get a feel for this from outside China. But yeah, there's this huge thing of, did China's savings just go kaput? And it's very hard to judge, and kind of the fact that you even ask the question, that you have this expanding, growing economy, this economy that's supposed to overtake the US, that's supposed to be the economy of the 21st century. And you're thinking of their savings, and it's all tied up in real estate, something that isn't producing anything, that isn't productive, that isn't that isn't going into companies to produce new factories or new equipment or hire new people. It isn't going into new capital investments. It's just sitting in real estate. That betrays a huge question of trust in the country and kind of what's believed there. That when Apple goes to China and has to build a factory, Apple has to supply its own money to build the factory. There aren't local investments keen to jump on what would look like a sure thing from their perspective, this foreign company that's going to relocate their supply chain over there. So China, of course, there's kind of always the divide. Governments don't like to acknowledge it, but there's a divide between the country and the government. You know, a country can do very, very poorly and suffer greatly, and the government just gets stronger and more powerful. Think of the Soviet Union in the 30s or 40s, where the Russian people have never suffered as much as they suffered them. And at the end of it, the Soviet government was a world superpower. Likewise, you know, I think most people looking at the future of the U.S. don't see much of a future for the U.S. government. That it seems sclerotic and declining. But by and large, you look at the actual state of the U.S., its creativity, its population growth, its ability to attract the right kind of immigrant, the fact that pretty much no matter what else happens to the world, all of the U.S.'s supply lines are contained within North America. So as long as the Canadians and Mexicans don't rebel and go to war against them, America's internal economy is very strong. Basically, my prediction would be that anything could happen to the U.S. government, but the U.S. would mosey on its own happy and healthy regardless, whether it would be united or not. Not divided states of America would probably be just as economically powerful as the U.S. currently is, perhaps more so. China, you look at the country, and there's this horrible decline to it. The population has suffered so much already, and they're looking to shrink so much. Um, the environmental contamination in terms of air quality. I've known people have gone over and spent 6 to 8 months in China and come back with horrifying, life altering health problems because the city they were in had the air was just that awful, and people are living there from birth. Birth. China, there's a ton of ruin in that country, ton of questions of what is sustainable, what's not. And that's before even getting into their ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs or Tibetans. But China is it's a communist country. As rough as it can be for the population, that doesn't guarantee that the government will decline or go down. Like it could be that the Chinese economy declines for the next 2 decades and the CCP becomes stronger for it. The exact same way the Soviet Union, was killing off, was directly or indirectly responsible for almost a million deaths a year. If you want to count the treaty, Stalin's treaty with Hitler, and the fallout from that that it could suffer that much and come out the first country to send a satellite to space. So China, I'd like to think that all this mismanagement, all that's been inflicted on the Chinese people, that would inevitably stop uh, a government like the CCP from becoming a superpower. But history has shown us that the country and the government are that disentangled.
Yeah, yeah, I think you make a really good point about the fact that we kind of maybe have this linear vision, maybe a little bit lulled by the idea of what populism might mean, what democracy means, how people react to political change. It's not linear at all if you look at history, and I think there is a lot of gas in the tank for the U.S. I think that's a really good point as well. Especially if you compare it to everywhere else, because the whole world is in decline, and the whole world has this problem of fertility. There's a demographic crisis. I mean, I'm in Eastern Europe, and I mean the demographic crisis here is very acute because not only are we not having kids anymore, and maybe we have slightly more kids than Western Europe, but not by a big margin. But we're bleeding young people to the West. I mean, we're essentially the lifeline, the IV drip into Western Europe, into America as well. And this cannot continue for very long. And, this is not a positive trend. It's not like, oh, Europe will be fine. No, nowhere will be fine. And I feel like still US will be finer than other places because of all the factors you listed. There's a lot of ruin in the US, and I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, especially compared to other places.
Yeah, Eastern Europe, it's Europe in general. It's interesting. The American Empire, if you want to model it, I always think of it as kind of a two-way empire that's shaped kind of like an hourglass. And of course, right at the center, connecting the two side are the American elite. But America's internal empire, kind of the empire that was built up through the 19th century, the expansion west, the purchase of Alaska, the capture of Hawaii, all that high imperial empire that's actually U.S. territory on the map. Uh, that's one side of the hourglass, and then the other side of the hourglass that really only interacts with it through the American elite is all the territory America captured during World War II. So Europe, Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, all these satellites that are part of the international community, which are U.S. client states or places the U.S. conquered during World War II. The idea that Germany is somehow an equal partner in the international community that was set up to contain and prevent it from ever rising to power again is laughable. But the interesting thing is, it seems that the American elite's cultural power is way stronger in in the external empire, the international community, than it is internally. So if you look at its mimetic power, like what a Democrat would say they believe in internationally, or what are the principles of good governance, or what should be the goal in terms of population. In Europe, every one of those things has been wholly adopted, and it's very hard to find a party that would disagree with it, or certainly disagree with it substantially. In the U.S., it it's facing constant resistance. It's kind of ironic. The American left will say, "Oh, I wish we could be more European," by which they mean more subservient to the American left. But
Yeah.
the so you look at the U.S. memes demographics, and the U.S. actually, of all the Western nations, has some of the best demographics in terms of fertility. I can't recall if they're still above replacement rate, but they're closer than almost anyone else. And if you look at the immigrants that are being brought in, as much as Americans complain about illegal immigrants and stuff, Catholics from Central America and Mexico are vastly more compatible with the U.S. than Muslims from North Africa or Central Africa. So the U.S. in terms of demographics is doing shockingly well, and ironically, it's because it's the place where the U.S. elite have hold some of the least sway. That the institutions that were set up to contain them are still somewhat powerful. Uh, I have no idea if this rings true for someone kind of living outside the North American bubble. Obviously, I'm in Canada. I'm a few hundred kilometers from the U.S. U.S. border. I have friends from the U.S. come up for day trips. But does this ring true to the European experience?
Yeah, I mean it's you've put it very well. It's the alignment with the core of the left in the US is extremely strong here. And it's just a status game because in a way the status lines here are very are much more simplified. So essentially um what the American left puts out is kind of an elegant anti-Americanism because it's still cool here to not like the US, which by that I mean essentially the caricaturized version of the US that the American left promotes, the kind of Michael Moore type racist heartlander and whatever deliverance style people
Yeah,
that
I hate
the American
America,
left
especially
shows.
the type that resists the American elite.
Exactly, exactly. So in a way, it's kind of couched in anti-Americanism, but it is the most American thing ever. And it's kind of it's has its own kind of negation built in, so people don't realize that they're completely subjugated to the core American ideals because what they get is like, oh, look, I'm following these brave warriors, these brave people fighting the system in America, and the system's portrayed as being, I don't know, Bible thumping, the parents from Footloose. Like these people don't actually exist in that way, but they exist as a foil for the actual American hegemony, and it really is a very effective thing because it's very complementary, and it also kind of sets up the European to not be kind of hit in their own ego. It's you're not following the U.S. You're just you're following the people resisting the U.S. So obviously this is a good thing to do. But the secondary layer to this, where in the U.S. you actually have, like you said, some form of real competition that's not as visible here. Though I think people are starting to pick that up as well. I mean, the internet is very hard to control in that way. It's kind of a bit of a wild card. So yeah, it's all on the table now. I wonder personally exactly how fast things can move with this new system that we have.
Yeah, no, in Canada, it's quite an interesting dynamic because, of course, Canada had a imperial colonial culture vastly longer than everywhere else, but our imperial colonial culture was for the British. So you go to classic Canadian historical sites, and they won't fly the the modern Canadian flag, which came out in the '60s. They'll fly the old red ensign that and a lot of our provinces still have a similar flag with the Union Jack and the red, and then a coat of arms that kind of notes which one you are. But so you'll go around to all these classic Canadian historical sites and all these questions that are raised now by our cultural elite, like, oh, does Canada have an identity? What does it mean to be Canadian? Blah, 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 blah. Of course, would just be unthinkable to any of these figures living in this time because there was very much an obvious cultural identity, which was kind of Britishness on the frontier. So it was a mix of um, kind of British high imperialism and kind of a settler colonial cowboy culture, and you see this intersect in interesting ways. And you'll have prominent Canadians who were kind of great champions of empire, who built great things, built European style castles to themselves. If you're ever in Toronto, visit Castle Loma. Was just there a few days ago. This great entrepreneur of his time, the man who electrified Toronto, tried to build this great capital and bank castle on a hill very close to downtown, and almost bankrupted himself doing it. But he was also the head of one of the local regiments that's very storied, the commanding officer, sir, because Canada was entirely a militia culture. So so he so there's all these stories of him having this castle and then bringing his troops there to train and stuff on his yard, or or there'd be some event happening and he'd pay out of his own pocket to send 600 men there from his unit and another massive amount of out of pocket to have them trained up so they perform very well at this international competition and whatnot. Or actually, a cousin of his via marriage was one of the greatest authors of the 1910s, 1920s. Stephen Leacock wrote all these great kind of humorous high imperial stories. He's still in the school curriculum in India. He's not in the school curriculum in Canada, but every Indian school child reads his humorous short stories about small town Canada because he was a figure on a par with Rudyard Kipling. So Canada had this intense, very patriotic, nationalistic culture, very distinctive to the region. Like you'll find Canadian British Imperial artifacts, and they don't actually look like British Imperial artifacts because they're way overdone. Like because they were colonials, they always played it up intensely. So at the same time, anyone in Britain would think, "Oh, that's a gauche, that's a parody." Like no one would ever create something like that. They did in Canada, so it's like the South Park representation of any time something British happens, they move it to Canada. It's bizarre and like a parody of Britishness or like the Wizard of Oz. That's actually a style that existed. You'll see it in like great posters of Queen Victoria looking down on you judgmentally and stuff. All these bizarre artifacts and was entirely unique. And of course, the 60s happens, the British Empire falls, and immediately, uh, the government scratches all of that, switches the flag even to the current Canadian flag. It's basically a corporate logo. Like it's actually symbolically meaningless. The maple leaf doesn't even grow in the majority of the country, just like a small section of Ontario and Quebec. And pretty much the culture disappeared. Now, obviously, there's a huge culture clash with that because a third of Canada is French, and you had this massive cultural tension that erupted in terrorism and nationalist movements in the 70s. Was never as bad as North Ireland or anything like that, but lots of mailboxes blew up, and the referendum, the 84 referendum, I believe, was like 44-56, and then the 1995 referendum was 49.56 to 50.45 or something like that, and was shockingly close. One of the great tragedies of Canadian life that the country didn't split apart. We might have had two coherent countries instead of one incoherent one. But but kind of the prime example of a country entirely having its culture disappeared and appeared in favor of kind of internationalized nothing. And now, of course, you'll get figures like Trudeau or members of his cabinet arguing Canada doesn't have a culture. Diversity is our culture, which of course they don't mean the actual cultural diversity that exists in the country prior to 1960. They don't mean any of the unique cultural output that existed then. They mean their specific ideal of diversity, which is people of all races, all religions, all creeds, all sexuality coming together and saying the exact same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem like Canada is one of the purest forms of the new airport lounge style country. Definitely very ahead of its time. But we are coming up on time, and I want to ask you the last question that I ask everyone. Do you have any sort of influence or recommended thinker? It could be a writer, it could be any sort of character that you think is maybe underrated. Doesn't have to be a very obscure type of character, but someone who's been influential in your thinking, and you think people would get something out of.
I'd strongly recommend the humor of Stephen Leacock. Uh, I just visited his museum a bit ago. I often characterize him as the first hipster. I once read a section of his short story to a friend of mine, and it being like, "Isn't this interesting?" And they're like, "Oh, that's so tired." 2015 called. They want their humor back, and I'm like, "Well, that was written in 1910." That that he's kind of eternally of the moment, internally of like a past that's way beyond on him. This very distinctive style of Canadian Canadian humor that if you actually trace the lineage, all of hipsterdom originates in Toronto and Montreal. Like it's biographic there back into the 90s and 80s, whereas like Brooklyn or anywhere else, it's like, oh, this was a trend that started in the 2000s. Whereas like you can actually name the core figures of like, oh yes, these people founded Vice magazine in 1991 in Montreal, or these people were doing this, or so and so was a prominent band member in 1998, and her dad was a poet who had a similar style. And basically, if you trace it all back through these two veins, it all kind of terminates that like that. Well, the first person to express that type of humor in that very distinctive and awkward way was Stephen Leacock, and of course, everyone's forgotten about him entirely. But he was once probably amongst the most prominent writers in the British Empire. He was a dear friend of what's his name? Head on the tip of my tongue. Um, Rudyard Kipling. He had correspondence with F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway. Like, was one of the major writers of his era, and is entirely forgotten because the Canadian government has chosen to kind of disappear him.
Yeah, that's a excellent recommendation. He hasn't mentioned. I didn't know anything about that. That's great.
If
Well,
you
thank
want
you.
to sample him, the National Film
Mhm.
Board did a great production of his short story "My Financial Career," which is on YouTube, and it's about 5 minutes. It's the entire short story, and it's you will watch and you'll be like, "Wow, that's the most Canadian thing I've ever seen."
Excellent. Yeah, no, I'll look it up and I'll put it in the show notes. That sounds excellent, Canadian. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been really lovely. I want to point people again towards your Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
At from Kulak. Most people will know me as Catgirl Kulak, though, and my blog is Anarchonomicon at Substack. You can also find that through my Twitter. And also check out the Bailey podcast hosted on Substack, and I believe it's still up on SoundCloud, probably everywhere you get podcasts from.
Excellent, excellent. We will. I'll put those in the show notes as well. And yeah, thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much, Alex.